Hey guys, my name is Corey and I've been freeze drying for about 10 years now. So I wanted to create just a complete beginner's guide to freeze drying. If you have questions when it comes to freeze drying, or if you're new to freeze drying, I'm going to try and answer everything that I can think of as far as what you would need to get started. Also, feel free to look in the description. There's timestamps to go to specific questions. With that being said, let's go and get into it. Okay, so first question, what is freeze drying? Freeze drying is essentially taking the water out of food the most gentle way possible. There's dehydrating, there's baking it in the oven, things like that are kind of a hot process. Freeze drying, what it does is it's completely different than all that. What it does is it takes and it freezes the food down to sub-zero temperatures. Like we're talking like negative 30 degrees. Once it's completely cold and there's all ice in there, you pull a vacuum on the food. If we are able to reduce the pressure in a vacuum chamber, we can actually get water to boil at room temperature. It's much the same as if you threw a bucket of water into space, it would immediately flash into vapor. Same thing happens in here. The inside of this chamber is essentially the vacuum of space. And if we can freeze the food, get it really cold, then we can get that water to leave the food and we can get it to stick to the edge of the freeze dryer. It's kind of more complicated than that, but at the end of the day, that's what's going on. And we've got videos on kind of more of the science behind it. But a rough overview, that's what's happening with freeze drying. Oh, and one more thing on that subject. When you freeze dry, you are reducing the water content in the food down below like 1 to 2%. Oftentimes we see it hover between 1 and 1.5%. And I've definitely seen values that were below 1%. It kind of depends on the food and how long you put it in there for, temperatures and things like that. But it dries the food out to the point that there will be no bacteria growing. Whereas with like a dehydrating process is more like 15% water content left over. So there's still going to be water left over in some of these other processes of drying, whereas with freeze drying, it's super gentle, you're not gonna hurt the food, and it gets a lot more water out of the food. What is freeze drying used for? So freeze drying in most cases is used to preserve food for 30 years. You can use it for a ton of other things. You can run a business with it, you can sell freeze dried food. When you have like strawberries and Special K cereal, those are freeze dried strawberries. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. A lot of times though, people are using freeze dryers to store food for 30 years. I would say that that's mostly what people use it for, or at least most of the people that I talk to, that's what they use it for. Having, a freeze dryer at home, it allows you to make things like Mountain House meals or Peak Refuel. It allows you to make those meals at home, so that way you don't have to spend an arm and a leg at the store to buy them. One of the biggest things when you're running a freeze dryer business, one of the biggest costs that goes into the freeze drying is the food and then the actual labor to produce the food. When you're able to do it at home, you're able to save a ton of money, and anyways, with camping and hiking, that's probably one of the biggest reasons. Also with hiking, it's a huge weight saver. So if you have a water source on your hiking trip, you can save a ton of weight because you're not carrying water around. Other reasons are healthy snacks. So one thing is that you don't have additives going into the food in order to preserve it. Literally, you can have a strawberry that's going to last for 30 years in a package and there's 0 preservatives in it, which is kind of cool. You can also do pet food with it and pet food snacks. People are trying to just help their dogs out, eat healthier, have healthy snacks for their dogs. I've talked to a few people who are preserving liver and things for their dogs. Kind of a cool niche market. Another thing that you can use it for is in place of canning, anything that can be canned can also be freeze dried. And in almost every case, the freeze dried item is going to stay longer. Another thing that I talk to a lot of people about is just not wasting food. So if you make a big pot of something and you can't finish it all, you either have to freeze it or throw it away. And with a freeze dryer, you have a third option. You can, you can give it out to friends and things like that if they trust your cooking. But anyways, with a freeze dryer, you can go ahead and just freeze dry it, and then you can put it away for a rainy day or just take it camping with you in the summer. How much does a freeze dryer cost? So there's a huge range of how much freeze dryers cost. So on the low end, you have home unit freeze dryers that can do anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds of food. Those cost about $3,000 to $4,000. And you got everything on the high end where you have a scientific machine that can only do like a pound of food and it costs $100,000. There's also commercial machines that are able to produce 200 pounds of food that cost $130,000. There's a huge range of freeze dryers out there, but specifically for the home user market, generally you're looking at $3,000 to $4,000. In some cases, if you want to go really large, $5,000 or $6,000, but for the most part, $3,000 to $4,000 is how much they cost. And the next question is very similar. How much does it cost to run a freeze dryer? One of the biggest expenses is just the food. You're either buying the food or growing the food yourself. If you're growing the food yourself, or you've got neighbors with fruit trees like I do, then sometimes that food is just free. The next most expensive cost is electricity. With electricity, the national average is 23 cents a kilowatt hour. In this area, we pay a lot less. On a medium machine, it's probably going to be somewhere between like $2 to $4, depending on, and it could be as high as like $5 or $6 if you're in California. If you're in most places, it's just going to cost like $2 to $4 to run a medium machine. For a large machine, it's going to be a little bit more, probably on the order of like $3 to $5, but it's not going to be double. And I would say that electricity is, again, one of the more expensive costs as far as like running the freeze dryer and keeping it going. So if you're looking at buying a freeze dryer, you don't want to factor in like a slightly increased electrical bill, only if you're going to be running the machine full time. If you only run the machine like once a week, you're literally adding like $12 to your monthly bill. But if you're running it 30 days a month, you're going to see about a $90 increase in your electrical bill. But that would be on the high end. Anyways, yeah, it just all depends on like how often you're running it. Most people run it, once or twice a week, pretty good average for most people, not that huge of an increase in your electrical bill. The next most expensive thing to keep up with as far as freeze drying goes is the mylar bags. Those cost on average about 50 cents a bag. And depending on how many bags you're using, if you're using a 5 tray and it takes 1 bag per tray, that can be about $2.50 a load for a large. And on a medium, you're looking at like about $1.50 a load for a medium. The last thing on the list is just keeping up with oil. Oil is a very low expense. I spend about $50 to maybe $100 worth of oil a year, and I run my machines a lot. There's not a huge expense in oil, but it is something that you want to factor in as far as like keeping the machine going. What size of machine is right for me? And I think that's a great question, because most people aren't going to need a large. If you're just doing stuff for yourself, you're not going to need a large. It's super nice to have a large, but at the same time, it's a lot of extra space, it's a lot of extra dishes. I don't enjoy doing the dishes, but it is kind of just one of those necessary chores in order to do the freeze dryer. Just like cooking anything, you've got dishes afterwards. I guess one thing that I factor into like what size is best for you. If you plan on doing a ton of food, or you plan on cooking for a lot of people, then maybe a large is correct for you. A lot of times though, a medium is just fine. A medium that is running all the time can outperform a large that is running part-time. If you want to do freeze drying kind of just as a hobby, just every now and then, a medium is definitely right for you. But if you think to yourself, hey, I've got a big family, I've got extended family that I want to cook for and I want to freeze dry for, and put away food storage for them, then a large makes sense. Usually the cutoff that I tell people is four people in your family and under, a medium is totally fine. 4 people in your family and over, like if you're cooking for grandchildren, extended family, brothers, sisters, then a large is probably right. The other caveat that I say with that is that if you are cooking for a commercial business, you definitely want a large or something like even larger. How many pounds of food can a freeze dryer do per cycle? Any medium freeze dryer can usually do about like 10 pounds of food, like 6 to 10 pounds of food, depending on the wetness or like the water content. The end of the cycle, like based on like how long the cycle needs, it's not a linear relationship like in an oven where you bake it for a certain amount of time and it gets a certain amount of doneness. It's kind of more of like a logarithmic exponential curve where if you overload a freeze dryer just a little bit, it's going to take exponentially longer to get that done. So in general, a medium machine, it'll do 6 pounds to maybe 10 pounds of food if you're doing something drier like meat. But if you're doing berries, you want to stick to the lower end, like maybe like 6 pounds. Large freeze dryers can do usually anywhere from like 12 to like 20 pounds of food, depending on the wetness. But sometimes with a large, you feel like when you're putting in just like 1 or 2 trays that you're wasting a load because it's like so much bigger of a machine. Totally a mental thing, really on the like financial side, like electricity and like the other costs that are associated with it. Totally doesn't matter, but there's just a mental block, I guess, in my head. So I end up using my medium machine a lot more. There's definitely large batches, especially in the fall when I have a ton of food coming out of my garden, coming out of my friends' trees. I will definitely use my large. So it's like, it depends on how you plan to use it. If you've got a big garden and you're like, hey, I'm just going to use it like, during the harvest season, but I need to process a ton of food all at once, then yeah, probably large makes sense. Can I put a freeze dryer in my kitchen? The answer is yes, but you probably wouldn't want to. So a freeze dryer does run 24 hours, usually per cycle. So if you put it in your kitchen, you're going to have to be listening to it for 24 hours. Think of like a dryer running in your kitchen for 24 hours. It's just kind of a constant background noise that like you totally deal with it, but it's just not awesome. It runs about 65 decibels, both medium and large. They run about 65 decibels. I guess the large might be a little bit more than that. But anyways, you want to usually put it behind a closed door. So even if it's like a hollow core door, like, there's no insulation in the door and like it's just like plywood, even that is enough to usually block the sound from, disturbing you in your living space. Personally, I don't like putting them in my living space. That's why I've got them out here in the garage, and they do well out here. The other thing, as far as my strategy goes, I usually freeze dry a lot in the winter because one, it's cooler out here, it helps machines function better, they freeze dry faster, I'm not putting as much stress on the refrigeration system, and on top of that, I can pull off a bunch of food from my garden and my neighbor's trees during the fall, and then I can just freeze dry all winter. As far as temperatures go, you don't want to get your machine below, say, like 30 degrees, and you don't want to get it above, say, like 85, 90 degrees. I know that some of the machines on the market actually have like a software that prevents them from running if it's over 85 degrees. So that is something that you're going to want to consider if you, have a really hot garage and you live in a really hot place like Florida or Arizona, then, maybe running it in your garage isn't conducive unless you've got air conditioning in your garage. Maybe putting it in a spare room is, a better option. The other thing, as far as like, where you place it, is that you do want it in somewhat close proximity to a kitchen because oftentimes you are preparing food and then putting it, into the freeze dryer. Usually that's done in a kitchen. Unless you have, benches like this that you can prepare food with, just something that you want to consider as far as placement goes. What kind of maintenance is required on a freeze dryer? And generally it's just comes down to two things. One is cleaning, anytime you use a food machine, you have to clean it. But then on top of that is just changing the oil. So I don't recommend any oilless pumps quite yet. Oilless pumps are really expensive, and again, they've only got a 3,000 hour service life, which is like 6 months. So if you run it a year or 18 months, generally we see failures at like 12 months to 18 months. I think it's like a $300 service, like every 6 months, like once a year that you gotta pay to get it serviced. Changing the oil, again, that's going to be the biggest chore when it comes to freeze drying, but it's not a huge chore. It's way easier than doing dishes. When it comes to changing the oil, all you gotta do is just drain it out and then just refill it. And it takes most freeze dryers, they take about 3/4 of a quart to maybe a quart of oil. And you don't have to throw away the oil after you use it. Oftentimes you can take it out, and if the oil still looks good, you can throw it through a filter and you can just reuse it. So again, I know a lot of people don't like changing the oil, but if I'm putting away food for 30 years, it's like changing the oil, it takes me 3 minutes. It's really not that bad of a chore. But yeah, the two biggest chores are cleaning and just changing the oil. Those are the two biggest like maintenance items when it comes to freeze drying. There is kind of a third one, and depends on where you put it, but sometimes you want to clean out the register, or like, sorry, not the register, the heat exchanger. So the heat exchanger sits on this side. If you are in a dusty place or you have it in a shop or something like that, you will want to clean out that heat exchanger because the refrigeration will start to not function as well if you aren't cleaning that out, unlike maybe like a yearly basis. And this next question, we've kind of gone over it already, oil versus oil-free pumps. Again, I just don't recommend oilless pumps. I just saw this the other day, but there are now like service packages that are being sold for the oilless pumps. And again, like $300 a year, or even more often than that, to keep up an oilless pump, plus like a $1,400 to $1,800 initial investment. That just seems like a lot to me. There's definitely a time and a place for an oilless pump. Personally, I don't like them, and I don't recommend them. And they're loud. Oilless pumps are a lot louder because you got a metal on metal seal that's creating the vacuum. So of course it's going to be quite a bit louder. What kind of oil does it take? We recommend using Dairyland oil or any kind of a dairy industry oil. So dairy industry oils are like, for the milking industry, are meant to ingest water. And the biggest thing that we see is rust in pumps. That's generally what can harm pumps and what reduces the lifespan on pumps. All oil pumps out there are made of the same mild steel casting material. So we recommend Dairyland oil. I really like it. It is a blue oil that you can see here. It is, again, it'll keep your pump squeaky clean. I've heard of like 3 or 4 people that use it and they literally change their oil every time, and their pumps are lasting like 10 years. And again, I don't know that I covered this already, but the pump will be the first thing that fails. So regardless of what kind of pump you get, unless you're spending $7,000 on a pump like a Leibold or like one of those European brands, your pump is going to be the first thing that fails. So the more you can do to prevent, I don't know, just prevent wear and tear, the better it's going to be for you and the longer it's going to last. You know, if I run my truck for 30 24-hour periods, that's like 50,000 miles on my truck. That's a lot of miles on conventional oil. That's all the oil, that's all this oil is. It's just conventional oil with a little bit of additives. So it's like a mineral oil. I just recommend more oil changes rather than less oil changes. You're always going to have a better outcome in the end. The other thing going into the oil, if you do want to look into other oils, essentially you just look at anything that says a vacuum pump oil is going to work for your machine. If you just get on the internet and just Google like vacuum pump oils, anything that you find that says vacuum pump oil is going to work in an oil vacuum pump. Do I need a different electrical plug for my machine? The electrical requirements for a medium are different than it is for a large. On a medium machine, you can plug them into any outlet. So if it fits, it should work. Generally, you still want it to be a 20 amp breaker, but on any medium machine on the market, you can usually plug that into a 15 amp breaker as well, and you're still like under the threshold. On a large machine though, it is a different plug. So it still plugs into what most people would consider a normal outlet, but there's a difference. So this is a large unit plug. And this is pretty standard across the industry. Any large freeze dryer on the market is going to have a plug similar to this. So you've got a horizontal and then a vertical and then the ground. It still fits into what most people would consider a normal outlet, but it's a 20 amp receptacle. In general, the 15 amp receptacles are like what you would think of like, you know, 2 vertical prongs and like the ground. That's a normal like 15 amp receptacle. The large machines out there on the market need a 20 amp receptacle because you're pulling a lot more power. So you want a 20 amp breaker and a 20 amp receptacle on a large, whereas on a medium, you generally want a 20 amp breaker and a 15 amp receptacle is going to work just fine. So on a medium, you can plug it in anywhere. On a large, generally you do have to run like a dedicated line that has that special receptacle. It's called a NEMA 20 amp receptacle. They're like $5 at Ace Hardware. If you've got like other freezers on the same breaker, if you're buying a large, you have to, it's not a suggestion, it's like you have to really like get rid of the rest of those freezers on that breaker, because if you've got like 2 to 4 amps per freezer, a large is going to put it over amperage and you're going to pop your breaker. You just don't want to be running much of anything else when you're running a large. How long does a cycle take? So in general, cycles take anywhere from like 24 to 48 hours. On more delicate fruits, you're definitely going to want to go longer in order to get those fruits done. It also depends kind of on the size. The larger units do take just a hair longer. So pound for pound, a medium can probably outperform a large as far as like, 10 pounds of meat in a medium versus 20 pounds of meat in a large. Generally, that's what we find, is that larges across the market do take just a little bit longer than equivalent poundage in a medium. You can do a lot to shorten your recipe. So if my recipes are starting to take over 24 hours, what I will do is I will say, hey, I want 2 hours for turnaround time for defrost and things like that. So really I want my cycles to take about 22 hours. If I find that my cycles are taking longer than 22 hours, what I will do is I will just shorten up the cycle by reducing the weight of the load. Usually plan for about 24 hours, and that includes dishes, defrost, cooking the food, running the load. What I will do oftentimes is I will just like schedule it like, hey, every 8 o'clock, every like 9 o'clock at night, change the freeze dryer out. And that's kind of like from start to start of cycle. So hopefully that makes sense. How do I clean it? That's a question that I get asked a lot. It kind of all depends. Obviously, soap and water is a great method, but you also want to try and like sterilize things as often as possible, especially when it comes to food. You don't want some crazy bacteria growing in there. You can use rubbing alcohol, or you can use like a bleach solution, like a diluted bleach solution. Personally, I've kind of become a fan of rubbing alcohol because it evaporates so easily. You do have to worry about flammable vapors when you're using rubbing alcohol, so definitely keep that in mind. But if you're using it in a place like a garage where you just open up the door, then rubbing alcohol is a great option, because all the alcohol is going to boil off and you don't have to worry about that smell getting into your food. Whereas with bleach, if you don't rinse it thoroughly, you may end up getting a little bit of a bleach smell or a bleach taste to your food. Personally, I'm not a fan of that, but I do know that bleach kills bacteria super well, and there are some bacterias that cannot be killed with alcohol. That's another thing that you want to consider is how sterile do you want it? Another thing that you can do is obviously just soap and water, so you can just take it to the sink or to the bathtub. On the larger machines, you do probably want to clean the tray rack. It's kind of what gets the most dirty. You do want to clean the tray rack in like a bathtub and like a shower head or something like that. It's a little too big for a sink. But on the medium units, they are across the board, across the industry, the medium units are a little bit easier to fit into a sink. Another interesting way that you can actually clean freeze dryers, or at least sterilize freeze dryers, is using ozone. So they make things on the market that are called ozone generators. You usually see them after a fire. They'll come in and ozone the whole house to try and get smell out. Ozone is actually a very potent antibacterial or antiviral way of cleaning. Ozone is also a very, very, very common sterilizer in the industrial food industry. You can buy a machine for like $40, and if you could sterilize it every batch, that'd be great. It's you never have to worry about getting some crazy bacteria in there, because it's clean every batch. How often do I need to clean the chamber of the freeze dryer? And that's really a personal preference. I have seen machines that have gotten moldy because they were not cleaned. And you definitely don't want to get to that point. I mean, it's moist in here after it's done, defrosting. You've got a lot of water that's left over. If you leave this thing closed and you haven't drained out the water properly, you haven't dried it out, it's going to get mold. You definitely don't want that happening. So I personally try to at least address the cleaning process. Every time that I freeze dry, I will dry it out. I'll make sure that it's squeaky clean. I'll leave the door open. It doesn't have to be done. It doesn't have to be thoroughly cleaned every cycle. If you're in an industrial kitchen, the answer is probably yes, it does need cleaned every cycle. But for home use, I mean, I probably clean it once a week, maybe once a month sometimes. It's definitely not every cycle though that I do a deep thorough clean. How long does the machine last? So in general, the freezer portion of the freeze dryer should last 15 to 20 years. It's kind of like a freezer. It's going to last a long time. The vacuum pump, on the other hand, will be the first thing that fails. Across the industry, vacuum pumps, they take the majority of the abuse when it comes to freeze drying. I've seen pumps last 2 years depending on maintenance, and I've seen pumps last 10 years depending on maintenance. Depending on how you're taking care of your vacuum pump, you are going to want to plan on buying a new one. Pretty much any vacuum pump on the market, as long as it's got the right CFM, is going to work for your machine. And that's across the board. Any manufacturer on the market of freeze dryers, you can really plug in any vacuum pump as long as the CFM and the amperage draw is the same. Again, on the refrigeration portion of the machine, 15 to 20 years. On the vacuum pump, kind of depends on how you take care of it, anywhere from 2 to 10 years depending on how you're taking care of it. Will oil get on the food if I'm using an oil pump? In general, no. So there are definitely pumps that do not have solenoids to protect the food, but most vacuum pumps that are, and I guess this is something that you do want to consider if you're buying your own vacuum pump, is whether or not your vacuum pump has a solenoid. So at the end of the cycle, what the solenoid does is it shuts the vacuum line, so that way no oil can spew back into the vacuum chamber. This was something that a lot of early on freeze dryers had problems with. They had problems with the oil spewing back into the vacuum chamber. So you want to just make sure that you're getting a vacuum pump that has a solenoid in it. The Blue Alpine freeze dryers also have a P100 filter that's oil mist resistant or oil mist rated. So if for some reason there was, oil mist return, I don't know, solenoid failed or something like that, then we do have a filter for that, just that way it doesn't get on the food. Can I put the machine on the floor, or does it need to go on a cart? The answer is it can technically go on the floor, but it's better on a cart. So one, when you put it on a cart or on a desk or something like that, then you've got very easy access to the trays. You don't want to be bending over in order to be sliding the food in and out. The other thing about putting it on the floor is that there is drainage that needs to happen afterwards. So you collect a bunch of ice here on the edge, and you've got to drain that ice somewhere. So if you put it on the floor, there's just not an ability to really get good drainage. And if it's on the floor, then your drain is literally at the same level as your catch, and it just isn't going to catch. You got to catch like a gallon, 2 gallons of water, and you're just not going to be able to catch that water unless you've got a floor drain or something that you could put it into. Generally, I just recommend, hey, just put it on a cart, put it on a desk, something like that. Do you need it next to a sink? And the answer is no. I keep mine on the garage. I don't have sinks out here or drains out here. I just drain it into a bucket, and then I just throw the water out on my grass afterwards. It is kind of nice to be able to just drain it into the sink. You never have to worry about emptying a bucket. But for me, emptying a bucket, it's really not that difficult of a task. How heavy is the machine? Medium freeze dryers are generally about 100 pounds, 100 to 110 pounds. And large freeze dryers are generally about like 130 to like 150 pounds. I think I've seen heavier ones out there, but in general, they're about the weight of a person. And this next question kind of goes into that last one. Can I transport it, and can it be transported on its side? The answer is yes to both of those. And that's, again, across the industry. Any freeze dryer can be transported, and any freeze dryer can be transported on its side. If you are going to transport it on its side, though, it does need to be stood upright for 24 hours because the oil that is in the refrigeration system needs to drain back into the freeze dryer. Or sorry, drain back into the compressor of the refrigeration system. Yes, you can transport them. Some are more flimsy chassis than others. I really like our chassis. We parked a truck on top of it. But that is something that you want to consider, though, is like if you're going to be laying on its side in like a small vehicle, trying not to bend or scratch anything, but it totally can be transported. Can I make money with a freeze dryer? And the answer is yes. The freeze-dried food industry is something like a multi-billion-dollar industry. So whereas the freeze dryer market industry is much less. If you want to make money with a freeze dryer, you can do freeze-dried candy, you can do freeze-dried fruit. A lot of those can be done with a cottage food license. If you want to get into more specialty items like meat, like freeze-drying meat for sale, those do need an industrial kitchen license. A freeze-dried chicken bucket, like from Amazon, like if I was to buy that bucket, it costs about $500 for 20 pounds equivalent of meat. So if I was going to buy that chicken bucket, it'd be $500. But for me, it cost me $75 to produce that. So if that is any indicator of the profit margins when it comes to freeze-dried food, depending on which food you choose, you can make a lot of money with freeze-dried food. Candy, I don't think is quite as good of profit margins as meat would be, but you're still like 2 to 3, I think in some cases like 4 times what that candy costs you to buy is what you can then sell it for. So there's still plenty of margin there, especially if you're doing it yourself, doing it at farmers markets or on the side. Like you can make a lot of money with a freeze dryer. And there was one time my wife and I, we actually did some freeze-dried candy, took it to a farmer's market, and it was the smallest farmer's market out there. I mean, it was like, there's probably like 200 people that showed up, and we made like a couple $100, and it was great. Like in just an afternoon, and it took us about a day to freeze dry all the candy. Like that was a very realistic way of paying the machine off or helping supplement your income. So this is a great question for more of like a technical side of things. Is for people on a solar power system, like on a solar array for their power system, how many watts does the machine draw? So in general, across the board, medium freeze dryers run about 1,000 to 1,100 watts. And across the board, a large freeze dryer runs somewhere between like 1,400 and maybe 1,600 watts, or right around the 1,500 watt mark. So for a medium machine, we'll just say 1,000 roughly, and for a large machine, we'll say 1,500 roughly. If you're going to try and run a freeze dryer on a solar array, I would probably stick with a medium freeze dryer because it's going to draw a lot less watts. You are going to have to either one, get a lot more batteries for your solar array, or in order to run it full time, like at night, or you're just going to want to kind of do a special load where it's like just running refrigeration at night because that doesn't draw a whole lot of power, and then running heat and vacuum pump during the day. This next question is more for our commercial side of things, but is your unit commercially rated? And in general, yes. So every freeze dryer on the market are usually commercially rated, and there is no technical like commercial rating. There are certifications that you can get like UL and NSF. There are no freeze dryers, no home freeze dryers on the market that are currently UL or NSF certified. A lot of us are working on that. A lot of the companies that are out there that are building them are working on that, but there are no companies that are certified certified yet in those two aspects. So if you're using it in a commercial setting, you do need to make sure that your inspector is okay with a non-NSF certified machine. It's just something that you want to consider. What companies are there that build freeze dryers? A lot of times I hear people talking and they say, hey, like I didn't even know that there was other brands out there. There is a brand that shall not be named that kind of takes the market. They are definitely the big boys on the market as far as like, SEO and like, Google searches, things like that. But there are 4 companies here in the US that are building freeze dryers. So there's the company that shall not be named, and there's Blue Alpine. I think I'm obviously biased that we have a great machine. Also the Cube, which is built in Utah, and then there's also Stay Fresh. 2 of those companies are just buying them from China and just importing them and selling them. Us and the Cube, we are building them here in the USA. We obviously have to get parts from all over the world, including China, but at the end of the day, us and the Cube, we are built and designed and assembled all just right here in Idaho, and then for them in Utah. Another question that is a really good one is, what does your warranty look like? Or in general, what do freeze dryer warranties look like? Kind of interesting. There is really like the similar warranty throughout the market. So all 4 companies and companies in Europe, we kind of all have the same mentality that a vacuum pump, it can wear out very easily and very quickly depending on how often you change the oil. If you never change the oil, I mean, it might last only like 6 months. But if you change the oil super often, it can last like 10 years. Across the industry, there is a 1-year warranty on any component, and then there's a 3-year warranty on the refrigeration. I looked at all the companies here in the USA just a couple of hours before I did this video, and that's how everyone here in the US is doing it, and some of the companies in Europe. As far as the warranty goes, refrigeration should last like 15 to 20 years. If there was an issue with that in the first 3, then it's like, hey, that's a manufacturer defect. So the first food question that I have is, does it alter the nutrition of the food? And the answer is yes. I mean, any food process is going to alter the nutrition of the food just slightly, but with freeze drying, you're looking at anywhere from like a 5 to a 10% nutritional loss, versus with dehydrating, you're looking at anywhere from like a 30 to a 50% nutritional loss. With freeze drying, you can probably push it as high as like 99% nutrition preservation if you're freeze drying at like 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Anyways, the answer is yes, but it is by far the most gentle food preservation process out there. Way better than canning, way better than dehydrating, and it lasts longer. What foods can be done in the freeze dryer? Pretty much anything out of your garden, anything with water in it can be freeze dried. Think of like vegetable oil. Vegetable oil has 0 water in it, so you're not going to be able to freeze dry vegetable oil. But in general, yeah, anything that has water in it that doesn't have milk fat or seed oils is going to freeze dry. Things like meat, even though meat has animal fat in it, for some reason animal fat can keep for 30 years. And I base that off of industrial products on the market. So you look at like Mountain House Meals, for example. Mountain House Meals has like an eggs and bacon blend that they do that is 30 years shelf life, and they will back it up. They'll say, hey, if you get a can that's 30 years old and it's bad, like we'll replace it. I mean, that's kind of proof in the pudding that like, hey, freeze drying meat and specifically animal fats, it does last for 30 years. Butter does not freeze dry very well, and things with cream in them also does not keep for very long. It only keeps for a few years. Do freeze dryers tell you when the food is done? Kind of coupled with that is, how do you tell that food is done? When you're freeze drying, there are a ton of different ways to tell whether or not the food is done. So you can use pressure to tell whether or not the food is done. As the water boils off the food and there's no longer water boiling off the food, then that pressure will drop. So you can watch the pressure. If the pressure drops, then the food is done. Another way that you can do is a water activity meter. So after the food is out, you can put the food in a water activity meter. They're about $500 on Amazon. And so like just a little device about this big, and you can tell whether or not the food is done. So that's a great way of doing it. You can also touch it and just break open pieces and just check for water. I personally like to put it against my lip and just see if there's any water left in the food. If there is like ice left in the food, it'll show up as a coldness on my lips, or like if the food's not all warm, then it's like, hey, there's something wrong with this, I need to put it back in. Another method that I hear a lot of is weighing the trays. You can weigh the trays periodically and see the percent change in the trays. And as long as the weight is staying the same, then there's no longer water coming off the food. There's a couple of really fancy things that you can do in industry called the pressure rise test and like a couple of other methods. We won't get into that here, but there's a multitude of ways of telling whether or not the food is done. The thing is that there is no one way that is foolproof. So think of all of these as just one data point. You want multiple data points to make sure that the food is done. Every tray, even just within the tray, there can be differences in how dry the food is. That can fool any one of these systems. If I'm taking my food out and putting it in a water activity meter, then I might not catch that, hey, like the side of this tray didn't get done, or like maybe the back of this tray didn't get done. If there are inconsistencies in how thick the food is, let's say you have very consistent, cut sizes throughout the entire dry cycle, or throughout the entire machine, and then you've got 2 or 3 really big pieces that got thrown in there on accident, or pieces that didn't get cut, those 1 or 2 pieces that are really thick can spoil a whole bag. So what you want to do is you want to check multiple pieces of food and multiple trays in multiple different ways. That's the best way that I've seen to make sure that the food is done, and that if I'm going to be putting away for 30 years, I just want to go through a little bit extra effort to make sure that the food isn't going to spoil in those bags. Can I do raw meat? And the answer is yes. I personally don't like to do raw meat, but I have done it. The main reason that I don't like to do raw meat is because when I take out raw chicken, it's dry enough that it creates dust that can then waft into the air or get everywhere. And because freeze drying preserves bacteria, you have to treat all those surfaces as though they are raw chicken surfaces. So I personally don't like doing raw chicken. I have done it, but if it were me, I would stick to like raw beef, just because although you still have to treat it like it's raw, it's just a little bit less. You don't have to worry about salmonella. So anyways, raw meat can be done, yes, but you just want to factor in safety and food safety with that. Does it change the flavor of the food? And the answer is yes, it can, but a lot of that is dependent on how well you rehydrate it. If you are trying to rehydrate ground beef, for example, ground beef is one that is often rehydrated too quickly, and people try to eat it 5 minutes after rehydrating it. So you want to make sure that you have enough water. If you don't have enough water, you're going to get hard nodules, especially in things like chicken or beef. So you want to make sure you add plenty of water to it, and then you also want to make sure to give it plenty of time. So it takes 24 hours to get the water out of the food. You want to give it more than just 30 seconds to get the water back into the food. You want to give it, a couple minutes, preferably 15, 20 minutes to really soak that water into the food. That being said, there are some things like chicken, for example. Chicken rehydrates pretty quickly depending on how you do it. Shredded beef, shredded pork are going to rehydrate extremely quickly. Also, depending on how you prepare the food can change whether or not it rehydrates the same way. So the answer is yes, it does affect taste a little bit, but for the most part, like when I do freeze-dried eggs, they taste the exact same as when I do fresh eggs. I literally, we've done blind tests, me and my wife, and I literally can't tell the difference between freeze-dried eggs and regular eggs. So it preserves the flavor pretty well. What is the best way to store freeze-dried food? The best way to store freeze-dried food is either in mason jars or in mylar bags. You really want to stay away from anything that has a clear plastic in it, because that clear plastic will not keep for 30 years. It might keep for a few years, but it's definitely not going to keep for 30 years. Mylar is a plastic layer, and then an aluminum layer, and a plastic layer. So there's actually 3 layers to mylar. And depending on how thick that mylar is, depending on what kind of materials they use in the mylar, tells you how long it's going to last. So you also don't want to assume that all mylar is created equal. You want to make sure that you're getting a good mylar that doesn't have so much of a plastic feel. It has almost like a tinfoil plastic feel. When you're using mason jars, you also want to consider storing them in a dark place, because light will destroy nutrients as it comes into the jar. So especially vitamin C is kind of a big one for this. Light will destroy vitamin C. So if you want the best nutrient preservation possible, you really want to stick with mylar or mason jars in a dark place. Whichever method you choose, you need to make sure that you're keeping it in an oxygen-free environment. Oxygen is going to be the biggest destroyer of nutrients. You'll spoil a batch of anything in 6 months if you don't remember to put the oxygen absorbers in it or vacuum down the jars. This question is more of a demonstration. So what is the food like when it comes out? And with that, I'll show you kind of what my chicken looks like when it comes out. So this is some of my freeze-dried chicken, and it is dry enough to just snap in half. Again, you're reducing the water content down to about 1% water content. And even just leaving it out here on the shelf, it can, if I open this jar, it would actually rehydrate just a little bit. But it's very, very powdery. Most things that you freeze dry are going to come out this way, whether it's fruit or meat, veggies, anything, it's going to come out very dry, very powdery. Sometimes when it has a higher sugar content, it doesn't have quite that powderiness to it. Sometimes the sugars kind of lock things in, but that's a pretty good indicator of what things look like when they're freeze dried. How complicated is freeze drying? And with that, I actually wanted to show you what freeze drying looks like from start to finish, from like a beginner standpoint. So for the most part, you just put the food in, press go, it's gonna get the food dry. The machine knows when to turn things on, when to turn things off. It's gonna do all of that on its own. As long as you shut the drain valve, it's going to get the food dry. So I am going to cheat just a little bit. I actually freeze dried a pineapple last night. I don't necessarily need to show the cutting process. I can just show you kind of the end result. But we're going to pretend like this is getting freeze dried, like this is fresh pineapple. You want to reduce the cut size as much as possible, or at the very least make it as consistent as possible. If I'm doing like bananas or pineapple or something like that, I try to do about like a I don't know, anywhere from like a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch cut. I really don't want to go more than like a 1/2 inch. When you're doing fruit, what you'll do is you'll organize your fruit and just set it out. You really don't want stuff stacked up like this, and you don't want stuff double stacked like that. If you double stack it, or if it's like leaning up, there's a chance that it won't get done. Chicken doesn't really care, but things like pineapple does care. If it's in contact with the heating surface, that's best, because it's going to get dry better that way. If I have bigger chunks like this, I will often set them closer to the front so I can pay attention to them and just make sure that they're getting dry. If this doesn't get dry in the middle, it could spoil a whole bag. I really want to make sure that every piece of pineapple is dry before I put it in a bag for 30 years. So once my pineapple is cut and arranged, I'm going to go ahead and open my freeze dryer and just slide my pineapple in. I would obviously want to try and fill up the trays if I can, if I'm doing more pineapple. Make sure the door is closed all the way, and then I go to recipes. And on our unit, every unit's going to have a different user interface, but on our unit, I'm just going to go here to delicates and then press continue. It's going to remind me to close the door, close the drain valve, and I just close the door. I'll show the drain valve next, and then you just hit continue, and it's going to turn on the refrigeration here in just a second. You can hear that kick on, and it will do its own thing from here on out. As long as my drain valve is closed, I don't have to babysit it after this point. So this is what the drain valve looks like. Again, I've just got mine going into a bucket. So you just want to make sure that this is closed and that it's closed all the way. If it's even open 1 degree, it won't be enough to get it closed and keep vacuum. So we're going to leave that there. So the first phase of freeze drying is just the freezing phase. I turned this machine off just that way you didn't have to listen to it in the background. The first phase of freeze drying is just the freezing phase, obviously. So everything's got to get super cold in here. You've got to get the food super frozen. Otherwise, the water will boil off the food instead of sublimating off the food, and it'll cause problems. So the vacuum does not run during this phase, neither do the heating pads. So you can hear the pump running in the background as well as the refrigeration, but once the freezing phase ends, the machine will automatically kick itself into the dry phase. And again, that's when the heat pads turn on as well as the vacuum pump turns on. Once it gets to the end of the dry cycle, what I'm gonna see is that the heat shelves are at their full shelf temperature. So I set it to 115 degrees. At the end of the dry cycle, I will see that it has reached 115 degrees. Once the cycle is complete, it'll actually go to this page. This is just the cycle complete page. And every brand on the market has their own cycle complete page. Ours, you can defrost it, you can add more dry time, or you can just go home. What's really interesting about our machine, and as far as I know, we're the only machine on the market doing this, our machine is still freeze drying when it's at the end of the cycle. So we actually keep the heat shelves on at 80% of the shelf temperature that you set it at. And we actually also keep it under vacuum. So the vacuum pump will kick on about every 10 minutes or so. So you're still technically freeze drying. If it finishes in the middle of the night, you are not going to have to worry about it because it's still freeze drying. Other brands out there on the market, I think all of the other brands out there on the market, they don't keep the heat shelves on. So if it finishes in the middle of the night, you got to turn your heat shelves back on, so that way when you pull the food out, it's not frozen and it doesn't condensate. But with ours, we keep it in that freeze drying state until you're able to check on it. So once the cycle is completed, vacuum pump is shut down, heat shelves are still on a little bit, and vacuum pump will turn on every 10 minutes. If I want to come here and check this food, all I got to do is just release the pressure here. That's the air rushing back in. And then you can pull your food out and you can check it, make sure that it's dry. Again, this is what freeze-dried pineapple looks like. So, very dry, it just snaps when I crack it. But it's at this point that I would want to take and I would want to put the food against my lip and just check for coldness. If I feel any kind of coldness or if I see any kind of ice formation, then I know that the food is not done. And I want to put it back in and just add more dry time. If the food is done though, so I take it out and I check it and the food is done, then I just go and I package it in mylar bags. So to package the food, again, I just want to make sure that it's dry and check all the big chunks, make sure that there's no problems with the big chunks. If I verified that, then what I do is I grab a mylar bag. And again, you just want to make sure that you're getting good mylar. And this is called a gusseted bag, this bottom, when it opens like this, that's called a gusseted bag. They're kind of nice to have gusseted bags rather than just like a sealed bag because you can get more in there. I like to take and fold it up like this, and I will just take and dump it in. Once I have all of my food or product or whatever I'm doing, once I have it in the mylar bag, you're going to want an oxygen absorber. I like to take and put my oxygen absorbers in mason jars because then I can open it and close it and reseal it, and it's really quick. And then it's just gonna suck down every time. See, there we go. So I grab one oxygen absorber, put it in the bag, reseal this, and I want to reseal it pretty tightly so that way it stays good. I'm gonna go ahead and just zip lock this, push as much air out of the bag as I can. And then just go ahead and impulse seal this. This is called an impulse sealer. It melts the bag as soon as I touch it. So you can hear it click on for a second. It's going to warm up that bag and it's going to create a seal. It's kind of hard to see that, but it's going to create a seal where it's melted the bag. And then from there, I just write, hey, this is pineapple. I made it in 2025. And from there, it's good to go. Hopefully you found this valuable. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'd love to chat with you. Thanks for watching.